Okay, so we've all heard the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt, right? It's this epic tale of divine power that's been around for millennia. But what if there's another story hidden inside it? A story that's not about miracles, but about ecology. Today, we're going to look at this ancient story through a completely modern scientific lens.
Yeah, the book of Exodus tells this incredible story of divine intervention. But what if science tells a different kind of story? Not 10 separate supernatural acts, but one single catastrophic environmental event. Think of it like a chain reaction, where each disaster just perfectly triggers the next. And that's the wild theory we're digging into.
All right, so just as a quick refresher, here they are. It all kicks off with the river turning to blood, and it just escalates all the way to that devastating final plague. I mean, this is a series of calamities that brought an entire empire to its knees.
This image of dominoes, it's really the perfect way to think about the theory we're exploring today. The idea isn't 10 random, terrible things happening. No, it's about a single chain reaction. One ecological disaster that sets off the next, and the next, and the next, until a whole society is pushed to the absolute brink.
So where does a catastrophe on this scale even begin? Well, according to this theory, it all starts with the river. So plague number one, the Nile, the absolute lifeblood of Egypt, turns to blood. And we're not just talking about a color change. This is a toxic event. The fish die, the water becomes completely undrinkable, the entire ecosystem is just thrown into chaos. This right here is ground zero. This is where the dominoes start to fall.
So, what in the natural world could actually cause something like this? Well, researchers point to a really fascinating phenomenon, a toxic red algal bloom. See, under just the right conditions, a certain kind of algae can just multiply like crazy, turning the water a dark, murky red and releasing some really powerful toxins. For any fish in that river, it's a death sentence. And that is why this first plague is so incredibly critical. In this theory, the toxic algae isn't just one problem out of 10. It's the first domino. Once it topples, it kicks off a cascade of events that becomes almost impossible to stop. All right, section 2, the ecosystem collapses. With the river poisoned, the dominoes start to fall, and they fall fast. This next phase connects plagues 2 all the way through 6 in one devastating, logical chain reaction. This lays it out perfectly. It all starts with the frogs, right? They can't live in the toxic river, so they flee onto the land, only to die. Now you've got 2 huge problems, a massive sanitation issue, and hey, no more frogs to eat the insects. So what happens? The gnat and fly populations just explode. Then, these swarms of biting insects start spreading disease to the livestock. And finally, with all the unsanitary conditions and constant insect bites, people start getting these awful, painful boils. It's a horrifying but chillingly logical progression. And here's that same chain reaction laid out in a simple table. You can see how each plague has a direct natural cause and a predictable, terrible consequence. It's really just a stark reminder of how fragile an ecosystem is. You poison the water and you don't just get sick fish, you get a full-blown public health crisis that ripples through every single level of society. Okay, so the next set of plagues seems to shift gears. We go from a localized ecological collapse to something much bigger, a kind of atmospheric assault. Next up, you've got the plague of hail. And while a storm of fire and ice sounds totally mythical, destructive hailstorms are a real, if maybe rare, weather event in this part of the world. Just imagine, you're already dealing with disease and swarms of insects, and then a storm like this hits. It's not just bad weather, it's a crisis on top of a crisis. And then, after the hail, come the locusts. And this isn't a myth, it's meteorology. Scientists know for a fact that specific weather patterns, like a long, hard drought followed by sudden heavy rain, are the perfect recipe for creating absolutely colossal locust swarms. We're not talking about a few bugs here. This is a moving cloud of hunger that can literally devour every green thing in its path, which connects right back to this idea of a wider climate in chaos. So what about those 3 days of darkness? Well, there are a couple of really compelling scientific theories for this one. The first is a super severe desert sandstorm, something called a Khamsin, which can get so thick it literally blots out the sun. The other big possibility is a massive volcanic eruption somewhere in the Mediterranean, spewing enough ash into the atmosphere to cause a temporary, widespread darkness.
Both are totally plausible.
And this quote from our source material really just hits the nail on the head. Whether it's an algae bloom, a hailstorm, or volcanic ash, these are profound, terrifying events. Looking at it this way helps us understand how an ancient society might have experienced and tried to make sense of such an unbelievable series of catastrophes.
And now we get to the final and honestly the most difficult plague to understand through the scientific lens, the death of the firstborn.
So this is the biggest challenge for any kind of natural explanation. It's not like a swarm of locusts that affects everything. This event is incredibly specific. How on earth could a natural disaster target one particular group of people inside a household?
The theory here is that this wasn't some new, separate event, but the tragic climax of everything that had already happened. Just try to imagine the state of society after months of this crisis. The water's poisoned, the crops have been wiped out by hail and locust, and diseases everywhere.
You know, in any large-scale crisis, it's always the most vulnerable who suffer the most. Widespread famine and epidemics, they don't affect everyone equally. The cumulative stress of malnutrition and sickness leads to higher death rates, and it's plausible that these conditions could have hit certain parts of the population harder than others, leading to a tragedy that was then interpreted in this very specific way.
So, how do we put all of this together? This brings us to our conclusion, where we can look at how these two very different perspectives, faith and science, can actually coexist. So on one hand, you have the theological narrative. It's a powerful story about divine power, about justice, and about the liberation of a people. And then on the other hand, you have this natural history inquiry, which is a fascinating study of ecological domino effects and environmental disaster. They are two different lenses looking at the same incredible story. And here's the thing, looking at it this way doesn't have to diminish the story's power at all. You could argue it actually does the opposite. Maybe it adds a whole new layer of meaning, showing us how profoundly our human stories are shaped by the natural world, and how our struggles with our environment have been woven into our oldest and most sacred narratives. This final quote just sums it all up beautifully. Looking at the plagues through both of these lenses reveals the enduring relevance of this story. It's a profound exploration of crisis, resilience, and our search for meaning when we're faced with overwhelming challenges, whether we see them as natural or divine.
And that's really the question I want to leave you with. Does a scientific lens change the meaning of this ancient story, or does it maybe deepen it in a way you never expected? Does understanding the how change anything about what we believe about the why? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this one.